According to Peter Singer, one ought to give to charity until one reaches the level at which, by giving more, one would cause as much suffering as one would relieve. To be more specific, with the money you have, you first need to take care of your own food, shelter, and medical care. Once that's taken care of, any additional money you have, not required for some other morally comparable purpose, should go to providing others with enough food, shelter, and medical care to prevent their suffering or death. Once everybody is provided with the basics of food, shelter, and medical care, perhaps people can do with whatever remains as they see fit. This is the position that Peter Singer defended in the highly influential article published in 1972 called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Peter Singer is almost certainly the most influential contemporary philosopher. His writings on animal rights and economic justice have both had significant impacts. As a philosopher, Singer doesn't just present an idea, he offers arguments in his defense. And in this video, I want to discuss the arguments that Singer presented in this article. The first premise in Singer's argument says, quote, I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad, end quote. He doesn't argue for this premise, he largely assumes that it's true. However, it appears to be a reasonable assumption. His second premise is a famous and widely discussed principle that states, quote, if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it, end quote. Now I want to take a moment to take a closer look at this premise and make sure we understand it before we move on. Singer illustrates this principle with a famous thought experiment that involves imagining an individual discovering a child drowning in a small puddle. The individual can wade into the puddle and rescue the child without any fear of drowning himself, the only cost to be some damage to the rescuer's clothes and some time. The way Singer described the case is as follows, quote, an application of this principle would be as follows. If I'm walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant, while the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing, end quote. Our judgment that it would be wrong to fail to rescue the child, and that we would hold such an individual in moral contempt for valuing their clothes more than the life of the child, illustrates Singer's principle. Note that Singer is using the case to illustrate the principle, not to argue for it. So now let's go back to the original argument and add a third premise. Singer doesn't explicitly state this premise, but it's clearly needed to reach his conclusion. It points to the fact that whenever one has some money that one intends to spend on something rather frivolous, if instead it is spent on the food, shelter, and medical care of somebody who would otherwise suffer or die, one is preventing something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral worth. This then leads to Singer's famous conclusion. Singer's more precise quote says, we ought to give until we reach the level of marginal utility. That is, the level at which, by giving more, I would cause as much suffering to myself or my dependents as I would relieve by my gift, end quote. The bulk of Singer's article, then, argues for a significant increase in private charity. As long as there are people in the world who are suffering and dying from the lack of food, shelter, and medical care, then one can prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing something of comparable moral worth by giving to charity any money that one would otherwise spend on anything lacking comparable moral worth. We may assume that movie tickets, fine dining, jewelry, and vacation cruises are not of comparable moral worth. Just a note, Singer allows that there may be other more efficient ways to reduce suffering and death. Perhaps one can prevent more suffering and death by contributing to a political movement that promises to increase government contributions to global efforts to prevent suffering and death. Perhaps investing in research to discover more efficient ways of growing food, or something like a malaria vaccine will be the best use of one's money. Nothing in Singer's theory rules out these options. However, while the theory allows for investing in these types of options, it does require investing in something that reason suggests will relieve death and suffering, rather than on frivolities. Singer specifically mentions the potential value of contributing to efforts at population control. Singer wrote, quote, "The conclusion that should be drawn is that the best means of preventing famine in the long run is population control. It would then follow from the position reached earlier that one ought to be doing all one can to promote population control. Since there are organizations working specifically for population control, one would then support them rather than more orthodox methods of preventing famine." True to his philosophical training, Singer then devotes considerable attention to considering possible objections to his thesis, reasons why people might think that there is no such obligation to contribute, or at least not to contribute as much as his argument prescribes. Somebody might think, look, I'd be happy to help if I knew my money was doing any good. But some charitable organizations spend a lot of their money on providing benefits for their executives, and some invest in projects that might not be doing any good at all. Singer answers this objection by inspiring individuals and groups to do research to discover which organizations will do the most good with one's money. You can discover who these charities are by visiting sites like thelifeyoucansave.org or givewell.org. Links are included in the description. Some might object that the child one encounters in the pond is just a few steps away, whereas those in need of charity are half a world away, and that this makes a morally relevant difference. Singer asserts that distance is no more morally relevant than skin color or gender. If the child was drowning on the other side of the world and one could rescue the child by pressing a button on one's computer screen to drain the container, one would be obligated to do so, regardless of distance. Even if rescuing the child involves some small cost, it's no different than the cost of wading into the pool. Singer wrote, quote, "I do not think I need to say much in defense of the refusal to take proximity and distance into account. The fact that a person is physically near to us, so that we have personal contact with him, may make it more likely that we'll assist them, but it doesn't show that we ought to help him rather than another who happens to be further away." End quote. Another argument that Singer considers says if everybody were to give a certain percentage of their income, then my fair share of that overall contribution would be, let us say, $50. Therefore, I only have an obligation to give $50. Against this response, Singer argues that our obligations depend on what the facts of the real world are. In the real world, the premise that other people are going to give a certain percentage of their income is false. One has to consider one's actual real-world obligation in light of this real-world fact. Singer wrote, quote, "The argument would be sound if the conclusion were, if everyone in circumstances like mine were to give £5, I would have no obligation to give more than £5. If the conclusion were so stated, however, it would be obvious that the argument has no bearing on a situation in which it is not the case that everyone else gives £5. End quote. Referring back to the drowning child example, imagine two individuals coming upon a shallow pond where two children are drowning in that shallow pond. Each could rescue one child. However, our agent notices that the other person isn't moving and will make no attempt to rescue a child. It would be problematic in this example for our agent to fail to rescue the one child, and after rescuing that one child, it would still be problematic for the agent to say, that second child is the responsibility of this other person, so I'm just going to walk away and let it drown. Assuming, of course, that the individual could save the second child without sacrificing something of comparable moral worth. In the third objection, an individual states, well, I can't rescue everybody. Where this is true, Singer argues that one is still obligated to rescue as many as one can. Imagine a fishing boat coming upon the survivors of a cruise ship that has sunk. The people dying in the freezing water while the captain of the boat says, my boat can only hold 20 people, so I can't rescue any of the survivors. These are the more common objections one hears against contributing more to charity. All of them seem to fall a bit short of being a viable defense for a failure to make such contributions. At this point, I want to reconsider one of the assumptions of Singer's argument. It's the assumption that when one puts something of moral value against something of non-moral value, the moral value always wins. Recall, the only thing that would justify a failure to make a contribution is sacrificing something of comparable moral worth. Let's imagine that a student promises to meet virtually with a teacher at 2 o'clock. Now, keeping a promise is a moral obligation. But just before the meeting starts, the student is in a situation where keeping the promise will cost, let's say, $500. And we can assume that this student has $500 that the student has been saving for something that the student wants, but it's something which has no moral worth. While the student may owe the teacher an apology, the student is not obligated to spend the money. This example suggests that non-moral concerns can sometimes outweigh moral obligations. Of course, keeping a promise in this case is not a matter of preventing suffering and death. However, we do allow people permissively to pursue non-moral goods at the risk of suffering and death. For example, I eat more than I should, and my diet isn't always perfectly healthy. Sometimes the taste of a donut, or 2, or 3, well, I eat donuts while fully aware of the fact that if I were not to eat them, I could potentially live a longer life with less suffering. Yet I eat them anyway, some of them. So I could prevent something bad from happening, my death and suffering, and I would not be giving up something of comparable moral worth in doing so, only my donuts. But it doesn't follow from these facts that I morally ought to give up donuts. Here's another example. We can start with the premise that suffering and death as a result of automobile accidents is bad. We can then add Singer's principle, premise 2. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. We can, in fact, prevent something bad from happening if we were to give up driving, except in those circumstances in which driving serves something of comparable or greater moral importance. Driving a sick child to the hospital would be permissible. Driving to a movie, probably not. If we were to give up all non-essential driving, we would likely bring about an overall reduction in deaths and injuries due to traffic accidents. Incidentally, we would also reduce death and suffering due to pollution. And again, we're only giving up convenience, not something of comparable moral worth. From this, we would get the conclusion that we ought morally to give up driving for convenience. We are morally obligated to only drive when it serves a comparable moral purpose. But this conclusion, just like the conclusion in Singer's original argument, seems a bit extreme. This type of extreme conclusion is built into Singer's principle. So long as we can prevent death and suffering without sacrificing something of moral worth, according to Singer, so long as what we sacrifice is our enjoyment, we ought morally to make the sacrifice. Let me go through that again. Singer said that if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. Now, it's within my power to prevent something bad from happening if I give up donuts, and it is within our power to prevent something bad from happening if we give up driving, except when it serves a greater moral purpose. In giving up donuts and convenience driving, we are not sacrificing anything of comparable moral worth. Therefore, if Singer's argument was sound, we morally ought to give up donuts. We morally ought to give up driving for convenience. And we morally ought to give all money that would otherwise be spent on things that do not have moral worth to preventing suffering and death. This counter-argument gives a reason to question Singer's principle. The objection doesn't imply that Singer was entirely wrong and one is morally less free to allow a child to drown in a shallow pond or to refrain from rescuing children around the world. There are still good reasons to condemn those who have the means to rescue these individuals at little cost to themselves, but who fail to do so. The argument only suggests that things that are not of comparable moral worth can, in some cases, outweigh moral concerns. People's right not to suffer and die as a result of automobile accidents doesn't justify prohibiting others from driving except when it serves an interest that is of comparable moral worth. The prevention of suffering and death matters. It matters a great deal. It's just not the only thing that matters.